Hi everyone. So I hope you are enjoying your weekend so far. Um, we are going to be starting Module 3, not directly at the beginning of Boyer Chapter 6. There's just the very end of Chapter 5 that I decided to put into this module instead of rushing through the last 3 slides I had with you the last class before your exam. I thought that this would actually be a nice breaking point because we're going to start with the battles of Lexington and Concord, which are going to be the first battles of the American Revolution, even though they happen before we declare independence. So I thought that it would be a nice break. We can start with those battles and then we can sort of add this very tail end of chapter 5 into um, this module 3, because we can continue right on to talking about the war and the development of federal and state governments, which will be um, the main crux of the next couple of lectures for us. Okay, so the battles of Lexington and Concord are going to happen while delegates are headed to the Second Continental Congress. So delegates are headed to the Second Continental Congress. I'm going to pause in the online lectures the same way I would do in a regular lecture. That way you have time to write things down and then you don't have to keep pausing and playing that YouTube video. And if I didn't pause and I just kept talking and you had to pause and play, then an hour recorded lecture would probably end up taking you 3 hours to go through. So I'll pause just like I would in class. So when you're thinking about the Second Continental Congress, you don't need to write this down, but let me just give you a brief little sort of reminder, I suppose. So when we had the colonists getting frustrated with incidents that were happening between the colonists and Parliament, um, we had that successful intercolonial meeting with the Stamp Act Congress in the mid 1760s that had seen these delegates get together, representatives from different colonies get together and decide that they're going to do this intercolonial boycott. And remember, that particular protest was successful. They were able to get Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Now, remember, Parliament also passed the Declaratory Act at the same time, which is saying we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, fine, but don't forget that we're still in charge. We still have the authority to legislate for you in all cases whatsoever. So when we saw that success in that particular boycott, and there are successes in other boycotts subsequently to try and get other taxes repealed, the colonists are going to see how helpful and how successful it can be if they all work together. So when they had met for the first time at the Continental Congress in the fall of 1774. That was the very last thing we were talking about in the lecture before your exam. And they had gotten together and they had said, look, this issue with Britain has really gotten out of hand and we need to figure out what to do about it. But they're not sitting there talking about, are we ready to declare independence? There are very few members of that meeting who think that this is going to continue on. Most of them think that they're going to be able to come to an agreement with Parliament, or that the king will finally see that the members of Parliament are corrupt and he'll step in and make it all better. So when they have that first meeting of the Continental Congress, it's really about, how are we going to continue to protest? How are we going to petition to the king to try and get him to see that we're being treated poorly by these corrupt guys in Parliament? But they feel this kinship with those in England. They feel like they're British subjects. They are British subjects, and they don't have this agenda yet to seriously consider splitting. And they're so, I mentioned in the last lecture we had, they're so convinced, most of them, that what they decide on, the boycott, the petitioning to the king, um, trying to ignore the intolerable acts as much as possible, they're so convinced that if they work together, they can rectify the situation, that they don't really think they're going to have to come back together and meet again. So they set tentative date in the spring of 1775 to have a second meeting of the Continental Congress, but most of them actually don't think that it's going to have to happen. But as we know, the king does not go, "Oh, sorry guys, I didn't realize Parliament was treating you so unfairly. Let me just rectify that and take away all your taxes, and we'll make sure we do things the way you want from now on." That doesn't happen, right? So we end up having the second meeting of the Continental Congress in the spring of 1775, and the delegates are headed there, which is in Philadelphia, and so the king in England is going to be assessing the situation from what he knows in England, and he is going to identify John Hancock and Samuel Adams as being the two biggest troublemakers in this whole situation. What's happening in all of the colonies, the protests going on everywhere. It boils down to these two guys who are both from Boston, and Boston has the reputation of being the worst of the cities in all of colonial America in regards to their rebellious behavior. I don't know if you guys can tell on your end, but I keep having to pause and go back and sort of record over what I had recorded because my dog keeps crying to come in and out of the room. So I hope that this isn't confusing you. So the John Hancock and Samuel Adams had been identified by the king as the worst perpetrators of these protests, and he is going to order British troops to go and find these two men and apprehend them and bring them to England and put them on trial for treason. And so, in addition to the fact that these guys are all headed, John Hancock and Samuel Adams are among those headed to Philadelphia for this meeting. In addition to the fact that these colonists are going to have this meeting together, we have a new governor in the colony of Massachusetts. So remember we had talked before about Thomas Hutchinson. You don't have to add anything here. I'm just going to talk about it while you're writing it down. We had Thomas Hutchinson, and Thomas Hutchinson was lieutenant governor and then temporarily governor of Massachusetts, who a lot of these colonial rebels in Boston severely disliked, not just politically, but personally disliked him. Samuel Adams, James Otis, even Benjamin Franklin, who was not from Massachusetts, is going to really dislike Hutchinson. He is recalled to England. Now he'd been the first governor in Massachusetts to actually be born in the colony, so he was not from England, but because of the severity of the situation in Massachusetts, the king is going to have him come to England, and he will replace him as governor with a military man, General Thomas Gage. And Thomas Gage is going to be the governor of Massachusetts, who will also be responsible for trying to bring order to that city with military presence if necessary. So he's going to send some troops, some British troops, to pick up some military supplies that are going to be near Lexington and Concord. And the idea is that he wants to prepare himself and his troops for if there's some kind of skirmish between the British troops and the colonial militia. So just a quick note about the colonial militia. You don't have to write this down. Many of you probably know this. If you don't know this, that's okay. So a militia, again, we had mentioned the colonial troops a little bit when we talked about the 7 Years' War. So remember, when I say colonial militia, or when we get into the American troops that are going to fight against the British troops in the Revolutionary War, when we have an official declaration of war, we're not talking about men who have the military as their career, right? We're talking about farmers, lawyers, merchants, people who do all sorts of things, who are willing to go pick up a weapon and learn really quickly, as best as they can, how to fight in a war. And they're going to be sort of this ragtag bunch in a lot of ways, that will go up against the military that has the reputation of being the strongest in the world at this time. So the when I say that Governor Gage is preparing for potential clash with the colonial militia, that's who I'm referring to. I'm referring to ordinary guys in the colonies who are so frustrated with the British troops that they're willing to pick up weapons and fight against them. Now, when we talk in the United States today about the Second Amendment and we talk about this extremely explosive issue, especially as of late, about the right to bear arms, this particular amendment was put in our Constitution because of these issues that were going on in uh, late colonial America. This fear that the British government is going to seize the weapons and ammunition that belong to the colonists or that belong to the colonies in general, and then force them to abide by whatever rules or whatever law they want and prohibit the colonists from being able to defend themselves if they need to against that government. So when we talk about the right to bear arms, it's a hugely controversial issue today, which I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, probably have strong opinions about. But that's where this whole debate comes from, right? So when we talk about the Second Amendment, we're talking about these men who create governments that are responding to this fear about things that are happening or that they saw happen in the 1770s with the British troops. Now, this is when we have Paul Revere, um, you know, riding through the colonies and saying the British are coming. Not all of the colonies, but we have this sort of mythical idea about Paul Revere on his horse, warning everybody that the British are coming, and that did happen. He was with another guy, and they actually were captured for a little while. I mean, it's really this sort of it's come down as one of those stories that I guess we all remember from elementary school. So that's the context. That's where this happened. So Paul Revere and another man, I can't remember his name at the moment, but I think William Dawes, but I'd have to check. They're going to ride through the areas near Lexington and Concord to warn people that the British troops are coming. So the colonial militia in those areas is going to organize itself and be prepared for the British coming, um, and attacking them or trying to enforce their will upon them or whatever. And what ends up happening is the colonial militia that have organized are going to meet up with the British troops, and they are going to have these little skirmishes at both Lexington and Concord. And Ralph Waldo Emerson, the writer, is later going to refer to this whoever fired the first shot in these two little skirmishes as the shot heard round the world. So in other words, it's um, this single shot in these small skirmishes. I mean, the casualties, they're not high. It's around 50 colonists and around 75 British. Um, it's not a huge event in and of itself, just these battles of Lexington and Concord, but it's this fact that this ragtag bunch of colonial troops is going to have the guts to stand and fight against the British army, the British troops who are there, trying to keep the peace and trying to maintain their authority, the king's authority over the colonies. And as we're going to see moving forward, and you don't have to write this yet or think about it too much yet, but as we're going to see moving forward, we have the American Revolution is going to happen here. We're going to talk about it next. And then we're going to see also the French Revolution coming very soon after this. And these two revolutions together are going to be very significant in world history. And I guess I should say maybe Western history, not necessarily world history, but Western history, which is what Westerners thought mattered at the time. Because we're going to see this shift of people who start to believe that democracy and republicanism, and we'll talk about the difference between those, um, are achievable and desirable, and greater equal rights for people is possible. And again, this is you have to put it in the context of the late 18th century, because when I say, oh, people believe in democracy and equal rights for people, we're still going to have slaves in the United States, right? So it's not the equal rights of today. Um, but essentially, this moment where we have the beginning of the American Revolution, this fighting at Lexington and Concord, the shot heard around the world, is going to be what starts the American Revolutionary War, even though we haven't officially declared independence yet. And it's this war, this American Revolution, that starts major parts of the world on this movement towards a new type of government. No more oppressive monarchies, is the general idea here. Okay, now, I told you that these delegates had been on their way to the Second Continental Congress. When you, again, think about the fact that these guys are meeting and they had met the previous fall, so not even a whole year, about half a year prior to this, and they thought, but by the time it's, 6, 7 months from now, everything will be fine. And not only is it not fine, but we've had these first battles. So this particular meeting, this second meeting of the Continental Congress or Second Continental Congress, it means the same thing, whether or not you put that word meeting in there. They now have to discuss not only what to do in regards to the fact that Britain is not negotiating with them or playing ball with them or listening to their grievances and compromising, but they also have had this little battle. So they're still not ready for independence. It's May 1775. It's not that there aren't people discussing it or whispering it or considering it and thinking it might be the only option, but it's not the the tone in general, the belief in general is not that it's time for that. It's more of this has gotten really bad, but it's still resolvable, if that's a word, resolvable. So they're not quite ready for independence. What they do is they write this letter to the king, and it's called the Olive Branch Petition. And what you want to write here, and this is important because it shows you that they're not ready to break free yet. They still feel this kinship to their homeland, even if they were born in the colonies, they're still British citizens. They still feel this pride in being British. But what you want to write here, what you want to write as a definition is, it is a letter to King George III. Okay, so a letter to King George III. Reminding him of their loyalty and I don't want to use the word begging, maybe insisting that he help resolve the situation with Parliament. So it is a letter to King George reminding him of their loyalty and insisting that he help resolve the situation with Parliament. Because here's the thing, if they were to come out and say, look, the king is doing terrible things, he is putting all these taxes on us, then they are showing that they don't trust their king, or that they don't have faith in their king. And again, remember, they like their form of government. This is important to remember. They don't dislike being ruled by a king. They don't dislike that. What they dislike is that they think that Parliament, the members of Parliament, are corrupt. They think that their system of government is great. They think that having Parliament and having a king who is held accountable to Parliament is a good thing. But what they don't like is the way that they think the members of Parliament are overusing their authority, if that makes any sense. So the Olive Branch Petition is important because it shows us that they are still hoping to work with the king. Now, at the same time, in case the king is not sympathetic to them, because we have already had these first little battles, they have to start preparing for war. So they are going to create a colonial army, and that's called the Continental Army. So the Continental Army, those will be the American troops in the war. the war that's going to start very soon. So we're going to have the Continental Army. The leader of the Continental Army is going to be George Washington. He is in charge of the troops on the American side for the duration of the war. We're going to then have another small skirmish. This is the battle that most people refer to as the Battle of Bunker Hill. It's actually not at Bunker Hill. It's in a nearby location called Breeds Hill. So this is the exact same thing that you might remember learning about before the Battle of Bunker Hill. This happens this particular summer, the summer of 1775. So at this point, King George III says, and this is what you want to add here, he says, the colonies are in open rebellion. So the colonies are in open rebellion. Basically, what that means is he's saying they're officially all acting as traitors and will need to be dealt with as such. And, we are going to squash the rebellion type of thing. All right. Lord Dunmore's proclamation is important. So I bolded it because you want to remember. I bolded, on this slide, I bolded the things that you want to highlight. So I bolded Olive Branch Petition, Continental Army, Lord Dunmore's proclamation. You want to remember those things. There's going to be the next thing you'll want to remember too. I also have bolded. So let me explain to you what this is and why it's important, and then I'll give you something short to write underneath this or as a definition. So Lord Dunmore it's the official title of the man who is the governor of the colony of Virginia, and he sides with the king and parliament in this situation. He does not have sympathy for the rebels, and what he does is he's going to put out this proclamation that he states that any slaves in his colony who want to run away from their masters and come fight for the British troops and put down this rebellion will get freedom. And this is very, very important because remember we talked before about how the slave owners of this time period are always petrified that their slaves are going to rise up against them, and they have this fear. They sort of sleep with one eye open, so to speak. That their slaves will go against them. They will get weapons and they will come kill them in some way or another, or poison their food, or burn down their house while they're sleeping. They're afraid of these things happening. In addition to that, slaves are very valuable property, which is, again, ridiculous to think about the economics of slavery, but this is the way the colonists viewed it at the time. So you want to sort of think about it in that way when you're considering why they're so angry. So not only is this playing on a major fear that they have, that their slaves will kill them at some point to get revenge for the fact that they are enslaving them, and also the fact that the government is stripping them of their property in their view. So what you want to write here underneath Lord Dunmore's proclamation is the governor of Virginia makes it known. So the governor of Virginia makes it known that any slaves in his colony who run away to fight for the British troops, so he makes it known that any slaves in his colony who run away to fight for the British troops will get their freedom. And this is, you can probably guess this, but this is restricted to males. Now, you want to sort of think about this practically, right? So you don't have to write this down, but just think for a minute. It's not like there is a speaker system where he makes an announcement and all of a sudden a PA system comes out on every plantation and makes this big announcement to all the slaves. So a lot of the slaves never find out this information because, their owners make sure that information about politics is kept from them. They can't read. They don't, have any interaction with someone who might tell them this. So there are only about 1,000 in total slaves in the whole colony that are going to escape and go and fight for the British troops and then end up getting freed. So it's not necessarily that the numbers are huge as far as the number of slaves who are going to leave on account of this proclamation, but it's more the principle of the fact that this was seen as a very dangerous thing by the white slave owners of the time. All right, that is at the end of 1775. So I have here like months to sort of show you the chronology of the way that things are happening. Remember that I'm not big on dates. I don't care if you remember what comes first, Lord Dunmore's proclamation or common sense. I mean, in general, you probably want to remember what things happened before the revolution and what things happened after the revolution, right? So you want to put it in proper context, but you don't even have to write down these dates if you don't want to. Common Sense is a pamphlet. So in this time period, we have newspapers and then we have pamphlets. And pamphlets, it's like a short book. It's not a pamphlet like you would get if you went to a travel agency and you picked up a little pamphlet about a cruise to the Caribbean or something. This is like, it's more of a short book. And the idea behind a pamphlet is just that someone wants to write on a particular topic to get an opinion across, but it needs to be much longer than an editorial in a newspaper. So not so long as to be like a whole book, but longer than an editorial in a newspaper. And pamphlets were very common, very widely circulated, very commonly read by those who could read, or someone might someone who could read in a town might go to a tavern and read the pamphlet to other people who are there listening, who either might not be able to read or might not have access to that pamphlet. They might not have the money to purchase it, or so on and so forth. So this pamphlet is written by Thomas Paine, who was actually, kind of interestingly, a recent immigrant to the colonies. And the significance of the pamphlet is that and this is what I would write, it convinces many colonists, so it convinces many colonists that it's time to declare independence. It convinces many colonists that it's time to declare independence. You don't need to write this down, but basically, he's not putting out any new ideas about political philosophy. He's saying the same things that people have been saying for a decade about why the taxes are wrong, or why Parliament's authority is wrong in this circumstance or in that circumstance. But previous to this, a lot of writers who are writing about politics or political philosophy, they're using very academic language. They're using references to Latin terms. They're maybe writing some things in Latin. They're talking about complex political philosophical ideas, writing about the state of nature and so on and so forth, that if you're not a college educated person, then you probably don't really understand all of the references. So he's going to say essentially the same ideas that people have been saying, but he's going to write it in very plain language. And then he's going to make this final leap. And I just want to show you this part over here. He's going to make this final leap where he says, and this sort of sums up his argument, there is something absurd in supposing a continent to be perpetually governed by an island. In other words, the colonies, the British colonies, are now so populated that why on earth would we let England, which is a small island, govern everything over here? And this just seems to make sense to a lot of people. So, I just put here number 3, remember the rights of Englishmen. He is going to really sort of hammer home that idea that the British colonists have the same rights as the British at home, and they believe they are the freest people in the world. They have the most rights of anybody at the time period. And if their government is being oppressive in their mind, then they have the responsibility to protest it. And if the government is not going to fix what they are doing wrong, then it is their responsibility and their right to create their own government, if that makes sense. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress actually votes for independence on July 2, 1776. So they vote, should we or should we not separate from Britain and make ourselves our own country? And they vote yes on July 2. The main author of the Declaration of Independence is Thomas Jefferson. I want to talk about it a little bit. I know you're probably still writing this. I want to talk about it a little bit and then I'll pull it up and show you parts of it. All right, if you're still writing, that's okay. I'm going to talk about this just a little bit while you finish writing everything down. Um, but the document itself, this is a written declaration, and I put plagiarism with a question mark at the beginning because Jefferson, who is very well educated, is going to basically lift entire phrases from writings of other people and put them in the document. And the idea of plagiarism and citing your source was not a thing in 1776. So even when you look at the language of the Declaration, if you think, wow, that's really well said, or wow, that's a really great thing that he wrote there, it might not all be written by him. There's a lot of it that was just sort of lifted, and some of it was altered a little bit. For example, a lot of you know the part of the Declaration of Independence that says that the people in America, what's becoming America, are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is actually um, mostly plagiarized from John Locke. John Locke is a political philosopher who wrote a book called The Second Treatise of Government. It is very interesting. It's hard to get through, but it's interesting. And he is writing about politics and political philosophy, and he says that people are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. And he talks a lot about the pursuit of property being this basic thing that humans will do or will want to do, but the reason that the word was changed from property to happiness in the Declaration of Independence is because slaves were considered property, and slavery is a not it's not so explosive of an issue yet, but it is not an agreed upon issue among the colonists. So there are some colonists at the time who oppose slavery or who just don't like it, and there are other colonists who are going to defend it till the end. And so because this issue of property, when you apply it to slavery, is contentious, they take out property and they put happiness. So social contract is another idea that comes from political philosophy. And this idea is very interesting. And basically, let me explain it to you, and I'll give you something short to put in your notes about it. And you can apply this to the politics of today. And you should. You should think about this when you're considering issues and where you stand on them. The basic idea about a government is that this. The government rules at the consent of the governed. In other words, the people who are the members of that society are allowing the government to have power over them. And they do this based on this idea of the social contract, which basically means that as a whole, we in our society are going to give up certain rights to the government in exchange for the government offering protection of the welfare of everybody. So let me explain with an easy example. It is against the law in the United States to murder somebody, right? So it is against the law for me to take a gun and go walk up to somebody on the street and shoot them for no reason, or say, give me all your money, and then shoot them, or whatever. So I have given up that right to the government. I have theoretically given up the right to kill someone to the government, who will monitor those who are killing others and will then punish them for it. And the purpose of us giving up that right to the government is so the government can ensure the well-being of everybody, to try and protect us from being murdered by other people. So there are some things that it's pretty cut and dry. It's pretty easy to say, well, yes, we are happy to give that up, that right up to the government, for the government to protect everybody. So there's not a lot of people, I would assume, in our country who think that we should be able to murder, or that we should be able to steal, or things like that. Where it gets tricky is when you get into issues that are very contentious, especially politically. So when you get into an issue like abortion, should the government make abortion legal or illegal? Are we giving that right up? Is it something that the government should not have a say in? When you get into other issues like the debates over the Second Amendment, about how many rights in regards to gun ownership are we willing to give up to the government. So in certain circumstances, this is pretty cut and dry. The social contract, the society is giving up rights in exchange for the government being able to regulate that stuff, and then trying to promote the well-being of everybody. So some instances it's pretty clear. Other instances it's very tricky. So theoretically, you form a government and give it some power to protect people, right? To organize things and to provide protection, the basic level. But then you have to make decisions about what you want that government to have the ability to do. And the more power you give the government, in a lot of ways, the less individual rights that you have. And that's a social contract. It's this understood relationship between the governed and the government. Okay, so it's sort of a tricky idea. It's really interesting if you read about it or think about it, but we can talk about it in class if you guys have questions. Now, the actual document, the actual Declaration of Independence, I don't even have that written in that way on here somewhere. This slide is about the Declaration of Independence. So where I say the document itself, that's what I'm referring to. I would maybe add that. You probably don't need to, but just so you know. This document is going to have two purposes. One is that it justifies their rebellion, and two is that it declares independence. So it says, we rebelled because of this. We are declaring independence. We are no longer going to be governed by you. And in the document, the colonists, the members of the Continental Congress, are going to list the grievances that they have against King George III. Now, it is significant that at this time, they're no longer saying the grievances are done by Parliament. This is the first time that they are directly accusing the king, sending this off to the king and saying, you are the one who has done these things. So I want to show you the document, not that you can't look it up whenever you're interested, but let's just look at it for a moment. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So basically what all that is saying is, if people who are governed by a government decide that they're going to go be their own government, then it is the proper thing to do to inform that government of why they're going to go be on their own. So here they're saying the things that they believe are essential to humankind and government in general. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. They have certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So, in other words, we now have not only the right but also the responsibility to go form our own government. They continue down below, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, so we have patiently been suffering, and such now is the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. Usurpations, that means that the king has taken power that doesn't belong to him. So he's taken power that he shouldn't have and used it against the colonies for his own benefit, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So he has refused to assent to laws. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, so on, so forth. Yeah, let's see. There are a few that I want to point out to you here. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has quartered large bodies of armed troops among us. He has cut off our trade with all parts of the world. He has imposed taxes on us without our consent. I think it's interesting and very telling to see that this is not the first one. This is not all the way up here. So when you think about the reasons that the colonists declared independence from Great Britain, I would like you to hopefully leave this class knowing that it's more complicated than just an issue over taxes. I know that when you think about 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you're not going to remember everything from this class, of course, but um, I hope that you do take away the fact that the American Revolution, or the movement towards independence by these Americans, is something that is slow and that is complicated. It's not just about taxes, it's about many things. And that this revolution that we're going to fight is going to put us on the path to creating a new government that is not only a new government for us, but it's a new type of government in the world. It's this experiment in a republic and in a democracy, and we'll talk about what those two words really mean. Um, and for those reasons, the American Revolution is unique and very important in the way that it starts to change the way that other people in the world think about their governments as well. Okay, so taxes. Let's see. Some of these we didn't talk too much about. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be ruler of a free people. So this is a direct personal attack at the king. Nor have we been wanting in our attentions to our British brethren. Again, saying we still consider ourselves British, and so on. We therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people in these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. They are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain. State in this time period often meant country. Okay, so I don't want you to get confused with that term. Is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, so on and so forth, things that countries can do. And then it is signed by all of these people. Now, When you think about the Declaration of Independence, what types of things do you want to remember? I would highlight government rules at the consent of the governed, and then I would highlight these two things down here, that it justifies rebellion, declares independence, and lists 27 grievances that they direct at the king himself. Now, here's the thing. Just because we've declared independence does not mean that the king is going to accept it, and it doesn't mean that the rest of the world is going to recognize us. So think about it. If we decided or the people who lived in Niagara Falls, I don't know if any of you live in Niagara Falls, the actual city of Niagara Falls, but say that all the people of Niagara Falls, the city, decide we're no longer going to be part of New York State, we're no longer going to be part of the United States of America, we're going to be our own country. And they say, okay, we're independent now, and they elect me, pretend that I live there, and they elect me to be their ambassador to France. And they send me to France, and I go to France to negotiate, because if you're a new country, then you need to establish relationships with other countries and have trade agreements and that type of thing. It doesn't matter if every single person in the city of Niagara Falls thinks that it is their right to be their own country, the independent Republic of Niagara Falls. That doesn't matter if the rest of the world does not recognize us as our own nation. So if I get sent to France, then the French government is probably going to laugh at me and not even send anyone important to meet with me, because why would they meet with me or recognize my independence when they have a relationship already with the United States? That would be silly of them, right? So, just because we say we're independent doesn't mean, okay, we're independent now, that's great, let's move on with our lives. We have to, first of all, force Britain to let us be independent, and that requires a war. Secondly, we have to create our own governments here. Okay, so we have to replace that government with something else. And thirdly, we have to establish relationships with the rest of the world. So it's extremely complicated. It sounds poetic, I suppose, or exciting to say we're independent and that's it. We're now our own nation. But that's in some ways that was the easy part. To come to that conclusion, maybe saying it was the easy part is wrong. Maybe that's not the right way of saying it. But the harder part comes next. All right, so that's where we're going to get into the American Revolutionary War. So this is Boyer chapter 6. And I'll give you a minute to write these things. I just want to make a few points about the armies on each side, the British troops and then the American troops. And the American troops, that was the colonial militias. Remember, the local people that would fight to defend their colony? They're now going to get together under the Continental Army, which is organized and run by George Washington. Okay, now you might still be writing. That's okay. You don't have to add anything here. Um, I just want to make a couple of notes, talk a little bit about these bullets that I have here. So on the British side, Britain has a higher population than the British colonies, which means there are more people to fight and there are more people to tax for the war purposes, right? So that's a benefit for the British side. Their army and navy is both, they have a professional army and a professional navy. So as opposed to just militias, ragtag guys who, are farmers and are willing to go pick up a weapon and fight for their independence, they have an army and a navy that are professionally trained, professionally organized, very disciplined, um, and have experience in fighting wars. When you look at the British side, those who are going to fight for the king, we're going to have British troops, and we're also going to have loyalists. Loyalists are American colonists who side with Britain. So most of you probably remember this, but in case you don't, if you want to add it, that might be helpful. So loyalists are American colonists, so people who live over here in the colonies who are looking at this whole situation and saying we just don't agree with the protesters. We don't want to be independent. They side with Britain. And there are different reasons for that, right? Some of them um, they might just think that the colonial rebels are troublemakers, or they might have economic reasons to not want to fight for independence, or they might be annoyed by the way that the British government is acting, but they don't think that it necessarily warrants a whole war of independence. So I don't want to give you the impression that every colonist is a rebel um, and supports the revolutionary cause. And then there are Hessians. So Hessians, these are German mercenaries. So in other words, they're troops for hire. So the British government is going to hire 30,000 Hessians, German troops, to fight for them, to fight on their side. Now, on the American side, as I have mentioned a few times, we have militiamen. So, what you want to add here after the so is they are not well trained and often inexperienced. So, they are not well trained and they are often inexperienced. Think about it. In this time period, it's common for someone who's 17 or 18 years old to go to war. But if it's 1776, 1777, 1778, and you're going to war, and you are 17 years old, well, 12 years ago, when we had let's see, 13 years ago would have been the end of the 7 Years' War. You would have been too young to fight in that war. So essentially, what I'm getting at is the most recent war on American soil was the 7 Years' War, but that was fought 1754 to 1763. So if you're of age to fight a war in 1776, you may not have experience because the most recent war ended over a decade ago. But in Britain, if you have this professional army that's always being trained, and Britain fights wars much more commonly, then you're going to have men who are not only better trained, but they're more likely to have had experience. Now, if you look at the issue of blacks in the colonies, so you have this untapped resource of troops. So one of the things that the army is going to suffer from on the American side for the whole time of the war is they're going to be in need of money and in need of men, supplies. They're basically going to be in need of everything. And so you would think that they might be willing to have blacks, free blacks, and or slaves go and fight on their side in the Continental Army. But again, that fear of arming blacks is real. And, whether they're slaves or not, even if they're freemen, the fear of allowing them to have weapons is always underlined with this thought that they might turn on white people, the former slave owners or their current slave owners or whatever. So at the very beginning, Washington is going to say no blacks. As time goes on, he will eventually allow about 5,000 blacks will fight on the American side during the Revolutionary War. The difficulties for the American side, and this is what I would add here. You want to write, they have a hard time uh, with their numbers of soldiers, shortages of food, clothing, and ammunition. So they have trouble with enough soldiers with their numbers. They have shortages of food, clothing, and ammunition. And as I mentioned, it's not a trained army. So that's always a challenge. Okay, so finally, one thing I want to add, and I don't know if this is something that you would have learned in high school or would have maybe seen about on a History Channel documentary or something like that. But if you were transported back into time and ended up at one of these camps, military camps, during the war, this would have probably um, made an impact on you. You would have noticed that there are hundreds and sometimes hundreds and hundreds of what are called camp followers. And these are women and children who follow armies around. And so basically, um, mostly women, but then also some children. So it would be like wives or sometimes prostitutes, um, and so on that are going to follow the army around as it moves and live in the camps with them. And they're going to help by, doing laundry or sometimes they actually work as spies every once in a while, or prostitutes would do their thing. But they are also a drain on resources, right? So they need to be fed and they need a place to sleep and that type of thing. So it's kind of an interesting aspect to warfare in this time period. And then finally, there's just a note, and this is where we'll leave it. This slide continues onto the next slide, if that makes sense. But I just want to leave this online lecture with this last note. I had mentioned to you when we discussed the 7 Years' War the differences in fighting, that the colonial militia, those troops here in the colonies were used to using guerrilla warfare. They knew that it was an effective method of fighting against local natives. Whereas the British thought that this was a dishonorable way of fighting, and they thought that you should meet your enemy face to face or more head on. And when you look at the way that the two sides fight in the American Revolution, the American troops probably would not have been successful meeting the British troops face to face on the battlefield in every battle over and over. So the colonial troops, which you want to add here, um, well, let me say this before I tell you to write anything. You want to remember that one of the benefits the colonists have is that they're fighting the war here. The war is completely fought here. It's called war theater. War theater just means the place where a war is fought. So you say theater of war, it means the location where the war is fought, right? And then when we talk about World War II, the war theater is not here. We are attacked at Pearl Harbor, but there's not like conventional armies, people shooting at each other here. No one comes and attacks us, invades us on our soil. The war theaters are away, not here in America. So the fact that we have the war theater, that can be a benefit and a bad thing. The benefit is that you know the terrain, you are familiar with the war theater. The bad side, the disadvantage, is that it is your place that is going to get destroyed by the fighting. But in this instance, in this case, in a lot of ways, it is a benefit because the American colonists, the American uh, troops, are going to be very familiar with not only the terrain, but also ways of fighting um, that work well here. So all I would write under warfare is the Americans stick to guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla as in Guerrilla. So the colonists stick to guerrilla, Guerrilla warfare. And the British um, are trying to put down, so the British are trying to put down a rebellion in unfamiliar terrain. So the British are trying to put down a rebellion in unfamiliar terrain. In other words, a lot of these British troops are not familiar with the place, just the place that they're fighting in. Not to say that there aren't British troops that weren't stationed here, that hadn't been here in the 7 Years' War, that weren't sent here, to make sure that Massachusetts was going um, to stop rebelling. So some of these guys were here, but there are more troops, especially if you look at like the Hessians. They hadn't been here. They weren't familiar. Okay, that's where I want to stop for now. My apologies for this taking a little bit longer than I had hoped to get recorded for you. If you have any questions on this, please feel free to email me, or I will briefly review these when we return to class, not this Tuesday, but next Tuesday, and we can talk about anything that you might want clarification on. And I hope you have a nice long weekend.